I would now like to ask on stage Olli Rehn and Heather Grabbe, so the first panel can begin. Now, as a brief introduction, Heather is the director of Open Society European Policy Institute, and my good colleagues in Politico, who I know love to make all kinds of lists, placed Heather as number 5 on the list of women who shape Brussels. Now, Heather is an expert on populism and having worked in the European Commission knows the EU inside out. Now, in Estonia, we all know Olli Rehn, who is now the governor of Bank of Finland. Mr. Rehn has also served as the Minister of Economic Affairs and for 2 terms in the European Commission. And actually, Heather and Olli also know each other because they shared one cabinet in the European Commission, not physically, but at least working together on Turkey and the Balkans. So I think it's best if you both come on stage, and I would then give the floor to Olli for a brief introduction.
Thank you, Johannes, for your very kind words of introduction. And let me, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, start by saying that it's indeed great to be back in Tallinn. And I want to warmly thank the Open Society Estonia for the invitation to this already 22nd Open Society Forum of Tallinn, still going strong despite all these years. Speaking in Estonia on international economic policy, I can't help starting by quoting the very famous Estonian monetary economist Ragnar Nurkse, who made his professional career at the League of Nations at its secretariat in the 1930s and 1940s. That is obviously the precursor of the United Nations. In his book called International Currency Experience, drawing from the traumatic lessons of the Great Depression of the 1930s and its terrible social and political consequences, Ragnar Nurkse wrote as follows, and I quote 1 or 2 sentences from there. The first requirement of policy on the international plane is that any country suffering depression at home should abstain from seeking to cure it by such beggar thy neighbor devices such as import restrictions or depreciation of exchange rates, at least below the equilibrium level. And he continued, but that is merely a negative requirement. The positive requirements imply, above all, a common acceptance by different countries of the same objective, namely economic stability at a high level of employment and a continuous coordination of the national measures designed to achieve it, unquote. In my view, this brief passage by Ragnar Nurkse pretty much illustrated the agenda and defined the agenda for the post-war construction of a rules-based economic order between nations. I should add peaceful and rules-based economic order between nations, or if you want to put it, the liberal international order as we know it today, or as we still know it today. Today, even if we have recovered from the economic slump recession that followed the great financial crisis, many imbalances still remain, and especially we are facing the danger of an unraveling of the international rules-based economic order in Europe and globally. For instance, the managing director, Christine Lagarde, yesterday, Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, Christine Lagarde, yesterday warned of weakening of economic growth, serious weakening of economic growth, unless trade disputes are de-escalated, as she put it. Therefore, to my mind, we would do well to remember Nurks's call for international economic policy coordination, even, or should I say, especially in the present climate of rising populism and economic nationalism. Against this backdrop, let's take note where do we stand today in the European economy, especially in the Eurozone economy. Both Estonia and Finland are members of the Eurozone, as you well know. We have, after very difficult, tough times and difficult decisions in the early part of this decade, 2010-2012, we have stabilized the economy and we have seen an economic recovery and stronger growth since 2013 in the euro area. We are actually about to start the sixth year of economic growth in the euro area. 9 million new jobs have been created since 2013 in the euro area economy. And looking at Estonia, earlier this year, Estonia celebrated its 100 years of independence. Besides this fact, there is also another reason to congratulate Estonia, which is its broad-based economic recovery. After the difficult years following the financial crisis, Estonia has now reached a stronger path of growth. Like Estonia, Finland is a small, open economy, and the uncertainties in the global economy are strongly reflected on both of us, both of our economies. The Estonian economy is even more so open with its ratio of openness of GDP of approximately 80%. Concerns about the rise of protectionism increase the uncertainties faced by small export-driven economies such as Estonia and Finland. An extensive use of trade restrictions such as tariffs on international trade would have a very serious impact on our fortunes. And against this background, it is important to note that the Eurozone reform has actually wider implications than only related to some, say, technical matters. I think it's important that we put the Eurozone reform into this broader context. The key lesson of the financial crisis and debt crisis is that financial stability is of first and foremost importance. It was neglected in the Maastricht talks, and we had to reconstruct the economic governance and financial regulation of the Eurozone. We have made plenty of progress since 2012, for instance, in building the banking union. And now the time is to complete this important institution for financial stability, which is of paramount importance for sustainable growth and job creation in Europe. In my view, we should follow certain guiding principles in this endeavor. The first one being creating a stability union based on the own responsibility of each and every member state for their economy and economic policy. And second, having sufficiently strong joint backstops as insurance policy so that we are strong and sturdy enough to withstand the next downturn or next recession. And hence, I'd like to, before concluding, I would like to emphasize something to my mind very important. There is a reason why Eurozone reform is anything but only a technical matter. It is linked to the overall future of Europe. The Enlightenment values which underpin the European social and political model are now being challenged both politically and socially, both from the inside and outside. Politically, a populist and nationalist agenda is unfortunately tempting to many, and socially, the values of tolerance, liberalism, and inclusivity are increasingly under threat. So, therefore, together we should continue to work for such Europe that opens up our citizens opportunities to innovate and create new businesses and thus jobs, for a Europe that promotes growth beyond its own borders through free trade agreements despite current headwinds, and for a Europe that guarantees civil rights and social justice in the digital age. To conclude, in this situation, reinforcing the economic and monetary union indeed should be seen as an essential element of a broader endeavor to strengthen Europe. Not only in the financial, but also in the economic and political spheres. This is of paramount importance, especially today, when the international role of Europe as a key standard bearer of liberal democracy and of the liberal international order has become, in fact, ever more essential than it may have been some years ago. So, dear friends, this is, to my mind, a broader policy agenda that can keep Europe relevant for its citizens and in the world, and thus help Europe to move ahead. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rehn. Heather, the floor is yours for your intro.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to come back to Tallinn. It's always a pleasure to visit, especially when the sun shines. And thank you to Mal for her invitation and also her important opening observation that democracy is also cyclical. And I think this is a very interesting question, particularly as Olli has just pointed out to us, the way that the economic cycle has had political implications which are still with us now. And it's an interesting question, I think, of how far politics is a cycle in the sense of a circle that comes back to the same place, and how much it's an evolution, which sometimes, as Nietzsche put it, repeats itself as comedy, and as tragedy, and sometimes as farce. Francis Fukuyama wrote in the early 1990s about the end of history, the idea that liberal democracy had triumphed over all other ideologies and political systems, and therefore would be able to live in perpetuity. These days, it looks more as if liberal democracy is also an ideology with a best before date. I say this without any particular relish, but in the same way that other ideologies have come and they've gone. Fascism died in 1945, communism died in 1989. There's a real danger that liberal democracy could also die if it's not cultivated and nurtured through practices and through good politics. There's a real danger, I think, at the moment that liberal democracy is being taken for granted, and that the series of crises here in Europe since 2008, since the collapse of Lehman Brothers led to the economic crisis and then the euro crisis, then of course we had the migration crisis 2015 to 16, and now we're having something of a values crisis at EU level. And in this period, politics is becoming very unstable. These crises have led to a reduction in trust in public institutions, to a certain extent in the European Union. But what's interesting is the way that citizens' views of the EU have actually recovered considerably. Support for the EU is actually now back to the levels that it was before the crisis in 2008. Here in Estonia, as you know, it's recovered to 69%. In Poland, it's at 75%. And it's across the Union, on average, as good as it was before the crisis. But trust in national political institutions has not recovered. And what's very remarkable is the correlation between falling trust in national institutions, particularly parliaments and political parties, and support for populism. In fact, if you look at the various correlations that you could make, you could see with the rise of populism across Europe, there aren't strong correlations with unemployment. Unemployment remains, particularly youth unemployment, remains very high in Spain, which does not have certainly not a radical right populist party, whereas in countries with low unemployment, populism has been thriving. Similarly, it's not actually well correlated with inequality. The numbers just don't add up, but it is highly correlated with trust, with loss of trust in political institutions, particularly national ones. So we need to look carefully at what's happening, what's causing this crisis of trust, and what are its implications. It seems to me that we're in a transition phase now. Antonio Gramsci wrote in the early 1930s in his prison diaries, the political crisis consists in the old dying, the new not yet being born, and in this interregnum, monsters arise. And he was writing about the breakdown of the political order following the First World War and the rise of fascism that was happening then. What we can see today is a breakdown in the political order established after the Second World War, of a clear structuration of politics into left and right, representing large groups of society, the conservatives, the more rural voters, the old interests, and often the owners of capital on the right side, and on the left side, the industrial workers, the unions, and the industrial economy. But that's no longer the case. In an increasingly digitalizing set of economies, increasingly open to the world, export-oriented especially, as Olli mentioned previously, those are no longer the big structuring forces of politics. We're seeing a fragmentation of politics into many different political forces and many different ideologies as well, many different ideas. New parties have arisen. For example, the Greens have arisen since the 1970s and 80s in a number of countries. But whereas the Greens started out as anti-establishment and anti-European Union because they saw the establishment as being against their environmental goals, and the EU too, they saw the EU as an agent of industrialization. Over the years, the Greens became part of the party framework. They became accepted into the political establishment. They gained representation in parliaments in a lot of countries, especially Germany. And over time, they also became strongly pro-European because they saw that the EU was a way of achieving their policy goals. They had strong policy goals about environmental protection and then, of course, later climate change, nuclear power, and so on, as well as a number of rights and values issues. And they saw that the EU could help them to fulfill them. I fear that the trajectory of the radical right populist parties that are arising in Europe at the moment is not going to be the same as that of the Greens. There are some of the new parties and movements, especially some of those on the left, but also some of the ones which are started as single-issue parties but started to take up particular causes, from digital and tech causes. We've seen a number of parties come and go on that. Also, some of the citizens' movements, I think, could also go mainstream and become part of the democratic institutions that we know now. But there are a number of really radical right populist movements which are highly unlikely to do that. And the reason why is twofold. One is simply that they're just not very interested in policy. They don't They don't agree with the idea that politics is supposed to be about policy choices, about parties competing for voters' choice of economic policy alternatives. You don't see comprehensive and clear economic policy choices coming from parties like National Rally, which has replaced the Front National in France, or Alternative für Deutschland, or indeed from, for example, Geert Wilders' Freedom Party in the Netherlands. Rather than a set of policy choices, these parties rather have a mindset. They put forward a worldview that politics is not about policy choices. It's about a contestation, a fight between a corrupt elite and the pure people. This is really how they see the world. This is the world they put forward. And of course, they tend to put the European Union, they usually put the European Union with what they see as the corrupt elite. And for that reason, it's very hard for them to be absorbed into the political system because they want to have absolute control of power. Ultimately, they're saying only I, the strongman leader, can represent the pure people, the will of the people. You often hear this kind of rhetoric from them. And they're not interested either in debating policy or in being part of the political institutions. They're very opportunistic. They tend to focus on identity. And they're also not interested at all in negotiation. For them, compromise is anathema. Compromise is selling out. Political opponents are not the opposition, they are enemies, and they're constantly mobilizing against the enemies. You also see this in the kind of populism put forward by Trump, where he talks about enemies rather than opponents. And of course, there's a large dose of nostalgia, usually, in their rhetoric. Make America Great is not a populist slogan. That's something that everybody's used from Woodrow Wilson to Barack Obama. Make America Great Again is a populist slogan because the again indicates the nostalgia, which is part of it. Similarly, Trump, like many other populists, including Nigel Farage of UKIP in the UK, as well as the others I've mentioned, also tend to put forward very strongly the idea that there are enemies out there, enemies of the people. Internal enemies, who can be women, they can be minorities. Often in the past they've been Jews. Nowadays the people tend to blame immigrants. And they're external enemies. And the populists put a number of different figures into that role, increasingly the European Union. So if populism is a mindset that's not about policy choices, but about structuring politics between the elite and the people, and it's not interested in policy choices or in taking part in democratic debate and democratic institutions, what does that mean for the European Union? I think it has very profound implications because populism can give national democracy a cold, which it can recover from, but it gives the EU pneumonia, and the EU can die from it. Why do I say that? Why do I put it in such dramatic terms? Because if you think about it, European integration is the absolute opposite of populism. European integration is all about overcoming differences between different nations, different peoples who have different views and different interests. Whereas populism is all about accentuating those differences, and one interest has to win over another. There's no such thing as a win-win solution for a populist in political debate. Populists mistrust elites. They mistrust even more the idea of elites negotiating with other foreign elites to come up with common solutions for their countries. They generally distrust foreigners. So the idea of people working together across borders is also anathema. So these are really two completely contrasting views of the world and views of the public interest. The populist view of only the pure people of this country who were born here, who are a homogeneous, monoethnic people, which of course doesn't correspond with most European societies these days, but that's their ideal, is the absolute opposite of the European ideal of many different peoples, of many ethnicities and interests and concerns working together towards common solutions that work across national boundaries. And for that reason, populists oppose not only European values, such as those enshrined in Article 2 of the treaties, but they also oppose the EU's working methods. The whole idea of negotiations in Brussels between ministers is anathema to them, which is why they tend to come out against the EU. But of course, the problem is that means there is no room then in populist discourse for the kind of peaceful, rules-based economic order between nations that Olli was talking about, which is the foundation of our prosperity and which is absolutely essential for a single currency area like the Eurozone to work. And it's absolutely vital in future decades as Europe gets smaller in terms of GDP and population globally that we really can't afford to turn inwards. European countries are all small these days, as Paul-Henri Spaak put it some decades ago. The difference is between those who know they are small and those who haven't realized it yet. In fact, all European countries are small, including the one that I know best, the UK, in global terms, and will become smaller in future decades. So we need to get used to this idea, and we can really very ill afford a long transition period of populism which causes us to turn inwards, close off to the outside world, alienate women, alienate minorities, stoke social tensions, undermine the rule of law, and stop cooperating across borders. We just can't afford to do this. So what's the answer here? Well, the answer is we need some more political movements and a revival of political parties with some new ideas who can recapture voters, particularly the voters who have voted populist for the first time only in recent years. Those are absolutely essential. And of course, we need people to speak out for why European integration is the foundation of prosperity and why a peaceful, rules-based economic order benefits everybody. Winston Churchill said long ago that democracy is the worst form of government, apart from all the others that we've tried from time to time. And I would finish by saying to you that European integration, the European Union, it's pretty bad. It doesn't work terribly well. It's maybe the worst form of regional order we've ever had, apart from all of those others that we tried from time to time over the previous centuries. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much both to Heather and Olli for a great start for a debate that we're about to embark on now. Before we look into the future, which has always been the motto of, I believe, this forum, I would like to go just for one question into the past. And if you could both reflect on, let's say, one or two key moments from the last decade where actually the liberal elites failed to grasp an opportunity to, well, let's say, use this moment of crisis to make the necessary reform. Olli, I know the banking union is still halfway there, right? I mean, is that one of the foundations that should have been fixed? Maybe you can start.
Thank you. I think you are right that the banking union or an equivalent would have been needed already many years before the financial and debt crisis. But in fact, this is also a broader issue of, say, European Atlantic sphere or the advanced economies. We know that the global financial system is very much based on dollar, and the United States has a very strong role there. Thus, the run-up to the financial crisis is perhaps the most, say, the largest, biggest disappointment or mistake that we had, so that we enabled these large macroeconomic imbalances accumulate, and then they bursted with full power in 2007, 2008. Mainly because of the failings in the financial system. Now we are fixing that both in Europe and have been fixing that in the United States. In Europe, it's important that we would complete this work and at the same time then tackle also other important policy issues, not least how to make Europe stronger in the field of security and defense cooperation, or in dealing with the issues of immigration and refugees, which are very much fueling populism these days.
Heather, did the elites miss a chance to fix it for good? I mean, to put a patch that really works, so we shouldn't be talking about end of liberal democracy today?
It's so easy to fix these things in hindsight. And of course, in a way, what's happened with this series of crises around the euro and then migration actually tells you just how overly democratic the European Union is. The reason for the failure is the failure to agree among political leaders. If, in fact, Europe was, as many of the hegemons, as many of the populists claim, a hegemonic order where Germany calls all the shots and we're all subject to the rule of a political elite in Brussels, these things would have been fixed overnight. It would have been no problem just to put in place the measures that everybody knew needed to be taken. And it was, in fact, the huge, intense debates that went on for months and years over how to deal with these crises and the competing interests were the reason why it was so hard. That's why the solutions were so hard to find, precisely because no one country calls all the shots and no one political elite is united around a particular solution. I myself think there were a couple of really key missed opportunities that allowed populism to flourish. So Olli is, of course, the expert on banking union and what needed to be done for the Eurozone. And I think that politically, what would have made a huge difference is if the EU had agreed on Europe-wide unemployment insurance. And the reason why I say that is, notwithstanding the technical difficulties of doing that, the power politically of citizens knowing they had some form of economic security from EU level would have been absolutely enormous. If people felt that they could rely on a check from Brussels if they were made unemployed, then it wouldn't be, as the Germans say, alle Peitsche keine Zuckerbrot. It wouldn't just be the EU enforcing fiscal discipline and austerity measures and just bad news and nasty things. It would be the EU also providing benefits. But unfortunately, all of those benefits come from national level. All of the social security, welfare benefits, unemployment insurance is national. So I think that would have been a really important symbolic thing, even if it had been quite small. And the other thing is, of course, during the migration crisis, to have a fair burden sharing system in terms of asylum would have been really important. Now, in fact, Estonia took part in, as I understand it rather successfully, in the mechanism that was set up, and things actually worked out well. But there were other countries that didn't do that, and it all fell apart. And that is having a huge ongoing crisis, and it's benefiting the populists a lot.
Well, what do you think, Olli? Would Finland ever agree on a common European social system? This is something that Emmanuel Macron is actually arguing that could be the future. I understand Northern Europe is not very enthusiastic about that.
I think it's very much related to your concept of European integration, so that if you believe that we are on the road towards a federal Europe, and if you believe that it makes thus sense to concentrate important policy areas to decision making in the European Union or Brussels, then I can see the point that Heather makes concerning the unemployment insurance scheme at the European level. On the other hand, if you have a pro-European but less centralizing or less ambitious view of the European Union, which I would describe as a realist, functionalist view of the European Union as a consortium of nations, as a community of nations, then I think I would lean on saying that this would be quite difficult. I mean, shifting responsibility on social policy to the European level would be very difficult for the member state governments and a significant part of the population to go along with. Concerning President Macron's initiatives, I'm a bit bothered of, I'm not referring to you, but I'm a bit bothered to the reaction in Northern Europe, including sometimes, say, the interpretation of the statements of the so-called New Hanseatic League, in a sense that I don't think we should only draw red lines and say no. To my mind, it's more important that we try to build a synthesis between the insights of German economic philosophy, which is based on a stability union, and say French economic philosophy, both in quotation marks, because they represent certain philosophies across Europe. But for shorthand, you can say German and French economic philosophies, which include a stronger role for Eurozone governance and policy measures at the European level. I think it is possible to find a creative synthesis between German and French views by combining risk reduction in parallel with risk sharing. And I would welcome if also Northern European nations would be, in this sense, proactive bridge builders so that we would get the Eurozone reform moving forward.
Well, I was looking at your presentation there, talking about the growth that we've seen for, 6 consecutive years now? I mean, if the liberal elites are struggling to keep or preserve their influence during a time where you can say that the economy is thriving or at least recovering, then, I mean, how worried are you that what will happen when things really turn sour? Because, I mean, more and more people are talking about the next economical cycle arriving pretty soon.
I think this expression, the liberal elite, is a bit problematic, and I see that it is widely used, for instance, in the Economist special edition on its 175th anniversary on how to revive liberalism. And the same goes for the Financial Times, for most of the Anglo-American media. I don't see that liberalism is somehow or should be reserved for elites. If I were a liberal, I'm an independent central banker, but if I happen to be a liberal, I would be a forest liberal from eastern Finland. And I think it's a fundamental issue that liberalism is based on democracy, and that's why you have to combine it always with the combination of liberal democracy, so that it is not only kind of a closed preserve of a certain elite, but it is a way of thinking because it is good for the people in general. And here I think there's a difference also to fascism and communism, in a sense that they hopefully have died, but at least in their statist, aggressive, oppressive form, which is basically inherent in those ideologies. But liberalism has one stronger feat, and that is that freedom is a very powerful force. And in the end of the day, you cannot stop freedom from moving forward. So it has headwinds, yes, there are waves, but in the end of the day, it is, to my mind, it's going to be stronger than the opposing forces.
Let me rephrase my question. How will the moderate center survive the explosion of social media and the populist movement in a situation where the economic situation turns sour? When we see the, let's say, center struggling right now, Heather?
Well, the key thing that's really shifting now is, I agree with Olli, it's not actually, I mean, I was trying to be provocative by saying, you know, is liberal democracy just another ideology that's going to hit the dust, bite the dust? I sincerely hope not, because I'm also very deeply liberal at heart. And I think the urge to freedom is indeed the thing that has given it its driving force. The question is how to make people still value their freedoms when they take them for granted, and when social media give them the impression that they have freedoms, even if governments are closing those freedoms off. And that's what has really fundamentally changed. That representative democracy was set up as a system when people had very limited sources of information, and they tended to respect those who had some education and some knowledge of the outside world. These days, you can get any number of sources of all kinds of information on this. And if you follow Al Jazeera, or even more importantly, Russia Today or Sputnik, you get a completely different view of the world from what the Estonian public broadcaster is telling you, let alone what most of the politicians are saying. And so for that reason, people feel they have alternative sources of news on the world. They feel that they can interact with a large number of people, but these may be illusions. It may be fake news, they may be interacting with bots. They don't necessarily know what's going on. And that makes it very hard for representative democracy to maintain its fundamentally liberal character of being the forum in which people have political debate. And the risk is that because social media create the illusion of much more interactivity and much more personal agency in terms of engagement with politics, that people simply turn away from the real institutions of democracy, from elections, from town hall meetings, from discussions with their representative and so on, towards the much more exciting, flashy-looking social media side, which doesn't actually deliver results to them, either in terms of a government that's accountable to the people, or indeed in terms of policies that work for their daily lives. So I'm actually very concerned about it, especially because the first mover advantage that social media has given to populists means that they have been much more successful at using the internet and digital means of communication than traditional parties. They were much quicker on the uptake. If you look at, say, between 2009 and 2014, the term of the previous European Parliament, the only parties that were using Facebook at that time were populist parties. Now the others have got onto it. Okay, it's good. They're not just relying on their websites, but they're still far behind populist parties in rallying people through social media. So it's very important that other parties catch up and use it properly, but it's also very important to recognize that there's a structural problem, that social media in particular, but also the internet generally, they do threaten the institutions of liberal democracy because they take politics into a new sphere where lots of artificial illusions can be created by outside forces outside the country and by those who wish to do democracy down.
Olli, the Five-Star Movement, I think last Thursday, declared a historic victory when they agreed on a budget with a 2.4% deficit that will allow Rome to introduce a citizen's wage, one of the promises the Five-Star Movement made before the election. Now, 2.4 deficit might not exceed the criteria, but with Italy's public debt going over 130%, it's certainly alarming. Now, is there something we can do except sit back and enjoy the show while the Eurozone is being blown up?
Well, let's hope it is not yet blown up.
It's pretty alarming, isn't it?
Let's not paint a crisis yet to the wall, because it's very difficult to paint it, to clean it off from there. But you are right, of course, that it is a serious concern, and I think it's a serious concern, especially from the point of view of ordinary Italians, because it is very hard to see that unsustainable public finances could facilitate an economic revival of Italy, which I think most of the people voted in the elections.
Well, you call it unsustainable financing. People in Italy are happy about finally receiving a citizen's wage. And now if Brussels steps in and says, no, Rome, you can't do that, it's a lost battle, isn't it?
It's going to be certainly a difficult discussion, but it's important that we see that if a country, any country, be it Italy or Germany or Estonia or Finland, once we have joined the Economic and Monetary Union or the Eurozone, then you have also signed up to certain commitments, certain laws and rules, and these include healthy public finances and respecting of the Stability and Growth Pact. Not only because these are the rules, but because it is generally considered as positive for your future economic development. And here I think if you look at Italy, Italy has plenty of potential, in fact, and therefore say the real problems of Italy are rather related to how to unleash, how to liberate this entrepreneurial and economic potential that exists in the country, and this calls for economic reforms rather than excessive public spending. But that's now in the hands of, first of all, the Italian government, obviously, and other policymakers there, including the president. And on the other hand, then the European Commission has to analyze and give its assessment on the draft budget of Italy. And then the Eurogroup, the Estonian government, the Finnish government, Germany, Netherlands, France, Spain, all members of the Eurozone will then peer review the result, and it's going to be a dialogue between the rest of the European Union, rest of the Eurozone, and Italy in that context.
But there's no real mechanism of control available, is there? I mean, if a sovereign government decides that this is the policy they want to pursue, it's pretty darn difficult to stop them.
There are certain rules and possibilities within the framework of these rules by the Commission and by the Eurogroup. But I would not want to dwell on that because that's more in the domain of the national governments and not so much in the mandate of the central banks.
If we look at the situation in Italy, Hungary, and Poland, I think these are the three first suspects when we talk about populist governments in Europe. I mean, I would add Greece, because I still remember the wonderful election promises Alexis Tsipras made to tear up the agreement with the creditors, which never happened, of course. So, but if you look at the path that led the populists to power, I mean, are there common things there? Are these comparable cases, or are they completely different and should be looked separately, Heather?
I think that there are common features between them which are important, but it is important to start with the fact that populism, as I was arguing, is not an ideology. And so it molds itself to the political circumstances. It's highly opportunistic. It's, as Margaret Canavan, the British political scientist, talks about it as being the dark side of democracy. Populism is always there on the fringes, waiting for its opportunity. So the more there is a space which is opened up in the center by the mainstream parties withdrawing or losing touch with the people or not providing answers on critical issues, the more the populists will come in to fill the vacuum. And I think that's largely what's happened in Poland, Hungary, Greece, and to an extent Italy. The collapse of the center, of both center-right and center-left, is what gave an opportunity for parties to come into government. And that's what makes these countries very different from countries where the populists remain on the fringes. They might play a role in parliament, for example, in the Netherlands, Geert Wilders' party. They might play a role, or indeed in the National Rally in France. They may even be in coalition in government, for example, in Austria, or indeed in Finland. But that's very different from where a populist party is the party of government, calling all the shots and controlling this the agenda. And what happened, and this is extremely important to understand about populism, that I mean, you can sit back and enjoy the show of populism. It's a highly entertaining show-based style of politics. This is also Trump. But once in power,
depends on your taste.
Yeah, it depends on your taste. But it's I mean, it's kind of quite riveting in its own kind of way. But what's really critical to notice is every one of these parties then heads straight for takeover of the state institutions. So, you know, Olli was referring to the inherently repressive tendencies of fascism and communism. Well, what populism, the natural tendency is, let's go and consolidate our hold on power and stay here. So the playbook was established in Hungary with Fidesz in 2010 looking to take over the judiciary, take over the state media, pack both the courts and the public broadcaster with its own nominees, reduce the role of private media and then buy them out and have them taken over and destroy their business model through state advertising, discrimination, and so on, and then go after the universities and the NGOs. And you can see the same pattern now happening in Poland, where the first target was the judiciary, also the media to some extent. Now there's an NGO law, and you know, I have no doubt the universities are under attack to a certain extent. And of course, that's the playbook we also saw in Russia, Turkey, Egypt, Azerbaijan. But the fact it's happening inside the European Union is really scary. Now, Italy is an interesting case because, of course, Italy still has more of a functioning opposition than is the case in Hungary. Poland also still has an active opposition, which is important. But in Italy, the big question is what will happen to the Five-Star Movement. The agenda of the Lega is quite clear. They're anti-migration. They've also been in power before, a lot at regional and local level. They've got experience of governing. But Five-Star, it seems to me, it's not quite clear which direction they will go in. There are protest movements movement, an anti-establishment movement, but they're not a coherent political party. They don't have party discipline. They have a lot of leeway for their MPs at national level and their MEPs in Brussels. And so the question is, does Five Star become like the Lega, an anti-immigration, xenophobic party, or does it become a bit more like Syriza, a party which in government starts to become more responsible and has to come up with economic policies and policies on everything from digital agenda to climate change. Mostly these parties avoid going into big transnational questions like digital and climate change and long-term issues like demographic change and social welfare systems. They just ignore that agenda and focus exclusively on migration. So the question is, will Five Star follow that route, or will it try to become more of a mainstream party?
Well, right now their policy building agenda is pretty interesting. I understand they have an algorithm which they use to measure public support. So populist in the purest sense of the word, and then they decide what kind of policy areas they will touch on. But if we think about the EU and the ways that this issue with rule of law could be tackled or handled, I mean, how do you see this proposal to start freezing EU finances, be it structural funds, for instance, if, let's say, Poland or Hungary refuse to address the rule of law issues? Is it an idea that's useful, or is it actually dangerous that could lead the governments and the countries even further from European integration?
Europe is fundamentally a community of law and of the rule of law. Having said that, we have some experience, as you referred previously, of the political tension or conflict between a member state and the European Union, or a member state and Brussels, as it is often put. And I have, from different contexts, some experience of that, and I would say that for the European Union it's quite difficult to win that battle, not least because usually the national media is largely on the side of the national decision makers, and it doesn't really matter always what is right and what is wrong, but it's kind of a very confrontational battle. So in practical terms, this is quite challenging. But I was listening with great interest what Heather was saying, who is indeed a leading scholar of populism in Europe, and I think there is much to take away from her analysis. And I think one factor which relates to this analysis is that. And here I do agree, even though I say that liberal democracy in the end of the day will carry the day, will win because it is such a powerful force. But there is an inherent problem of, say, the reinforcement of or strengthening of populism, which is that many of the societies become quite ungovernable, because you have instead of say more traditional right, left, center, or center left, center right context, you have rather a triangle, maybe the Greens and some other parties also in a quadrangle, but at the same time it is much more difficult to form coherent, consistent policy making coalitions, as we have seen in many European countries in recent actually 10 or 20 years. We had one in Finland up until 2015, composed of 3 center-left and 3 center-right parties, and this coalition couldn't really agree on any major reforms. You see the same phenomenon in many other countries. Sweden is going to be maybe an unfortunate test case in this regard, because it seems quite difficult to form a coalition government in Sweden, not to speak of a policy-wise effective coalition government. And the problem here is that ungovernability leads to inaction in necessary economic and other reforms, which usually blocks economic and social development in a country, which then further feeds populism and nationalism. And that's why it is a dangerous phenomenon in the end of the day.
Heather, I see you taking a lot of notes. You want to do a follow-up on that?
Well, I'm taking notes because I think the cases of Finland and Sweden are especially interesting. Very different cases, in fact, the way that the coalitions have been formed and also the way that the populist parties have played the party system, where the true Finns and the Finns came into government and then have really been quite socialized in the government and have had their support fall dramatically as a result, whereas the Sweden Democrats have stayed outside government and their support has been continuously increasing. And so I think this is one of the dilemmas for populist parties. They really only have three options. Either they go into government, they manage to achieve power, and they take over all the state institutions, and they essentially end democratic contest. This is the current Hungarian model. Or they stay on the fringes like the Sweden Democrats. They keep their support up, it continues to rise, and they don't cooperate with the government, but they may play a role in the parliament and so on. But they keep their popularity by being the anti-establishment, and AfD are doing this in Germany. But when they go into coalition government, that's often a very dangerous moment for them because they can lose all their credibility. This is what happened, in fact, to Jörg Haider and the Freedom Party in 1999 when he went into the coalition with Fiscal, where he didn't really shape policy, even on migration. In fact, and in Carinthia, he behaved more or less as a kind of standard Austrian social democratic government. And so often they find once they're in power that their niche of migration and identity politics means they don't really have any role in anything else. And they can't be in the comfortable role of just criticizing the government because they're inside it. So what do they do then? And sometimes they can take over. This is what Salvini seems to be doing in Italy. But where it's hard for them to do that and they remain quite a small force, they can be disruptive, but they don't really shape the government agenda. And as Olli said, this just leads to more and more frustration because people hear the anti-establishment voice. They say, here's somebody who's speaking for me. And then that person goes into government and doesn't deliver anything for them. And so what do? Do they blame that populist person for failing to keep his promises? Maybe. Or do they blame the system and say, you see, this guy, this is what Trump says all the time. You see, I'm here in Washington, I'm trying to do what I can, but the swamp is drowning me. Look at these Democrats, they're blocking me. And so what they do is undermine public trust in the whole system. And I find this really problematic because we don't have any alternative system to replace this. For as long as we have representative democracy, we need a parliament and we need parties. So, and liquid democracy, direct democracy, has not delivered on its promises. So I'm really kind of concerned that what we're facing now is going to be a cycle of falling trust. And what we need are some politicians who can come in and say, look, I can make this system work.
Is Emmanuel Macron one of those politicians? Are you enthusiastic about him?
Usually, as central bankers, refrain from commenting politicians. But as you referred to Monsieur Macron, Monsieur President Macron, I believe that it's very important that he has been trying to drive a European policy agenda forward. We may not agree in Estonia and Finland on every detail of that, but it's important that we have driving forces for a pro-European agenda today because we need that more than ever.
If we look at the next European Parliament elections, I mean, is Macron the only serious counterbalance to a European Parliament that could be very Eurosceptic? I mean, let me just test a few ideas. I mean, if you look at what Viktor Orban is now saying, that there's going to be a Eurosceptic revolution in the European Parliament and he's going to be the front man there, I mean, can you take this seriously? Can the populists combine forces, and could they actually reverse European integration? And to combine another question with it, which we started from, is Emmanuel Macron the counterbalance to even the score?
I have to look at the political scientist here, so
go ahead, Heather.
Heather, please.
Well, there's no question that populists are going to have a big blocking power in the next European Parliament, but will they have any building power?
Exactly.
So
could they name the next European Commission chief?
they can for sure prevent various candidates getting it, but it's not quite clear that anybody can name the next European Commission chief. Let's see what happens now, but it's not clear that the EPP is going to name that person either. So I think it would be very good if there's a good, serious democratic contest within the EPP with maybe one charismatic candidate, and so it's not all just bland and boring. But I doubt the EPP will be the kingmaker. It's a very messy and complicated thing. No, I think the key thing about the next European Parliament is, will it be able to pass any legislation? Because that's the real power of the EU, is passing legislation. The European Parliament can debate whatever it likes, but will it actually be able to take up its powers of co-decision under the treaties? Or will, essentially, the EU stop making legislation because nothing can get through the European Parliament, and instead all power goes to the Council, and ministers simply decide things intergovernmentally through various new kinds of agreement? I mean, Olli was, of course, at the heart of decision-making during the Euro crisis, when many decisions were taken outside the EU machinery, and he had the very difficult job as the commissioner responsible of trying to broker deals and keep things within the bounds of economic policy making in the EU, because the governments were quite tempted just to go off and do their own deals, and it was hard to retrofit them into the EU system. So something similar could happen in the future, that if no legislation can go through the European Parliament and there are other crises that would require that, intergovernmental deals become the main locus of decision making. And then you have to work out, how do you fit this with the treaty? And Europe becomes a bit of a jigsaw puzzle. So I'm concerned mainly about that. But the building power is also completely unknown. So the blocking power, if they block, then the member states will probably take over and the council will become dominant, which isn't very good for the system. It's not very democratically accountable either, really. So I think that's a problem. But in the building power, what do they want to achieve through the European Parliament? I mean, you mentioned reversing European integration. It's kind of hard to do that. The main way that PiS and Fidesz have done it is simply by saying they're going to ignore EU law and they're going to disregard European Court of Justice decisions. That's very serious. It really undermines the community of law, the rule of law, which is absolutely fundamental to the single market and Schengen and the common arrest warrant and so on. But might they also try to come up with initiatives that they try to get through the Parliament? I don't know. Their agenda is very limited. If you look at what even Viktor Orban has said about the illiberal Europe he says he wants to build, it's extremely vague. There's nothing really much there where is the positive agenda? And that's where Macron comes in. Could Macron come up with a common agenda? I mean, I'm not as federalist as Macron, but I would really like to see him devote some energy to building things in the European Parliament. En Marche actually getting together and forming some coalitions. I think the big question is, how much energy will he invest at European level when he's running into trouble in France?
Yeah, we have some examples from the time of the Euro crisis when, as Heather described, it was not possible for various reasons to use the community method, which can be blocked either because of the majority of the European Parliament would not go along, which has not yet happened, or because a coalition of member states do not accept to bring certain policies or creation of institutions to the European community level. And these examples are, for instance, the European Stability Mechanism, which was created as an intergovernmental arrangement outside the normal community treaty framework, and also the Fiscal Pact, which was kind of a supplementary to the reinforced economic governance in 2011 or 2012. If this becomes more widespread, it is, to my mind, a problem, especially for small states who have certainly much better and stronger influence through the community method, through the community institutions, through the Commission, Council, Parliament, than only at the mercy of larger member states. And that's why I think this concern that Heather raised of the European Parliament becoming actually a block to reforms that enhance and enable to utilize the community method is a cause for concern. But of course it will depend on the result of the European elections, and I hope we will not face this kind of a situation.
Well, this European Commission has tried to make the democratic base broader to enhance dialogue with citizens. And I think last night in Freiburg, Jean-Claude Juncker took part in a debate that actually marked the 1000th citizens' dialogue. Now, is that a platform of success, or is there, and I mean, if it isn't, is there any example of getting into a fruitful debate with the citizens? Because I guess the only way that the EU can succeed is when the people actually understand it and support it, right? So how do you see the citizens' dialogue and the Commission's ambition in creating a genuine dialogue?
I find it a really interesting experiment, actually. I must admit, I was a bit skeptical at first because it seemed to be quite token and quite small scale, but it's actually taken off. And because Macron was so keen on it, I mean, he pushed the agenda further than I suspect than the Commission, particularly the Commission spokesman service was really comfortable with. But they've ended up with, they had a panel which included people from every member state, a minimum of 2 from every member state. So there were at least, we know there were 2 Estonians there, for example, who came up with their own questions for what they thought people should want to talk about. The Commission didn't set the questions. And then it's gone around to all of the member states, and it'll finish up in December. And it's turning into something a lot bigger than expected. And I think it could become quite an interesting precedent. It could be something that the Commission does before every European Parliament election. And what's interesting is that what the citizens wanted to talk about were the big transnational issues where the EU can really add value, can make a difference. They wanted to talk about climate change, about digital revolution and the effects of technology on society and on the economy and on jobs. They wanted to talk about the long-term future of Europe. And yes, migration is there and so on, but it's not a predominantly populist agenda of just blaming elites and blaming migrants and blaming minorities. It's quite big picture. So I think there are some interesting lessons to be learned this year. And I see this kind of deliberative process of consultations and debate as being much more fruitful than a long series of referendums. And okay, I'm British, so I'm a little bit sensitive about referendums. But I think that that direct democracy has its downsides. That's why representative democracy was created. Direct democracy has, in particular, the downsides that it often lacks really good information. It's easy to spread lies because you don't have people who are well informed about the issues who are deciding. It lacks often a really serious iterative process where people can look at the issue several times and interact with others and so on. And it lacks often expertise as well on what are often quite complicated technical matters. Now, if you look at the history of deliberative forums of citizens, for example, citizens' panels or citizens' assemblies, you can have each of those 3 elements. So I would really like to see the Commission in its next term investing in that kind of thing a lot more and using it to feed its thinking on policy and shaping its agenda. But more referendums, yeah, not so convinced.
On referenda and on citizens' dialogue, on referenda, even though I'm a liberal democrat with a small l, small d, nevertheless, I believe that the Finnish way of doing referenda is the right one. It is that we have a rule that only do a referendum if you are sure about the result beforehand. We've done twice. Once to terminate the prohibition law, 80% of the people were in favor of that in 1932. And the other time when we decided to join the European Union in 1994, when we also had a very strong majority for this decision. But even more seriously, so I think this citizen dialogue has actually been, I agree, a better success than I also expected. I think I did one of the first citizen dialogues here in Tallinn with Siim Kallas, and I recall we had a very lively debate among ourselves, plus also with the audience. And I've done many of those ever since before I went back to Finland. And even though they may not solve all the problems of the world, but they bring a very healthy kind of natural dialogue on important issues that are of real interest for citizens between policymakers and citizens. And I believe that they are, in fact, a part and parcel of the evolving European democracy.
We have a good chance to continue this good tradition here among the citizens that have gathered here. There are two gentlemen over there. Okay, well, I see one of them has already stood up. Go ahead.
I have a question to Olli. As you know, Paul Krugman, Nobelist, many times said that Chicago Liberal School of Economics is dead. And you invited also for more cooperation. This means that John Keynes is in agenda. We know that more cooperation is made between grade 7, grade 20. The European Union is also great. But my question is to you as an economist, scientist, who have wrote the dissertation on Nordic countries as corporate countries. And that's why I have a question. Beside the openness of international trade, Nordic countries can be also characterized as a small cooperative countries. I have read your doctoral dissertation, and that's why I have a question. What is the role of small corporate countries in the globalized world, and how small countries can cooperate between each other, because economic cycle might be different for big countries and small countries. And Finland is belonging to the group of small advanced economies initiative countries. What do you think about this global cooperation between small countries to protect the interests of small countries in globalized economic world?
Thank you very much for the question. Should we take a few more, and then, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Ensaku. I come from the ICDS think tank in Tallinn. Here I want to challenge you a bit on your notion that the populist political parties don't negotiate or don't like to negotiate. Because when we look, and you actually came later to it, that in a way, we are in a coalition government in Finland, in Austria, in Italy, in Greece, maybe I'm missing someone. We have seen in Finland, as you said, the true Finns were quote-unquote socialized through that experience. The same happened in Syriza. We have no idea where it's going in Italy, but there is, of course, an example where actually two different populist forces even were able to negotiate between each other and, agree on some governing platform. Maybe it's actually that the established parties don't like to negotiate with them. Take the examples of Sweden and Germany, for example, over recent elections. Populists did well, but the, let's say, quote-unquote, establishment parties, that's the term I think they're using, shunned them. So that's one thing. And then a comment, really, and thank you, Mr. Rehn, for looking also at the vocabulary, what we're using, kind of liberal democracy, liberal elite, and so forth. I don't think this is very helpful to have this kind of generalized titles, because I think also social democrat can be in elite and a conservative can be in elite first. And second is, I think it's really those populist forces, they are anti-establishment forces. So, and we don't need to have a prefix to democracy or democrat in a general sense of that, when it's going to be with a little, not capital letters. And I think really when we look at from a perspective of the establishment or anti-establishment forces, when I think it seems that Brussels in Europe has taken the same significant symbolic place as the DC or inside the Beltway is in US politics. In US politics, everyone who is challenging, who is a challenger, talks about, I'm from the outside of Beltway, I'm going to go in and fix this swamp there inside Beltway. In European politics, the Beltway is Brussels. And this is against which you are basically contrasting your let's say, ideas and so forth. So I think that's maybe a better terminology. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have more questions? Okay, gentleman over there, please.
Hello. My question is for the former Vice President of the European Commission. I'm Hector. I work at the French Embassy as economic counselor. After the crisis, we have implemented different instruments to foster convergence and prevent asymmetric shocks to happen, like the insurance deposit, the deposit insurance mechanism in the banking union, and the SGP, which is also an instrument with the fiscal buffers, which can help us to foster convergence within the Eurozone. I was wondering about your opinion as a former EU official about this Franco-German proposal that we raised during the Meseberg summit of a common budget within the Eurozone. I personally think that it would be a good idea. It will help to foster convergence. It will help to invest in different particular fields linked with innovation, with technological change. And yes, was just wondering about your opinion about this question.
Well, thank you. Let's answer those questions and see if we have more from the audience. Go ahead, Olli. I think most were for you.
Thank you. Thank you. Very pertinent questions indeed. And I start with the one on small states. And I believe that, yes, there is a need for international cooperation between the small states. And there is, for us Estonians and Finns, there is a good forum, good community for that, that is called the European Union and the Euro area. That's the place where we can cooperate and cooperate in a way that we ensure that we have full access to the single market and there is full equal treatment of member states and their citizens and businesses within that single market. And also that we have the trade policy protection of the European Union in a world where unfortunately we are facing increasingly the pressures of not only populism but also protectionism. And as you referred to my doctoral thesis, you had it right. But it's written 20 years ago, and actually more than that, 22 years ago. And I kind of already predicted then that we are living in an era of economic transformation, which will mean that these structures of democratic corporatism over the Nordic countries will have to adjust. And to my mind, they have been doing that often with very difficult processes of reform. We know it in Finland quite well. And in our case, for instance, tomorrow there's going to be an action day by the trade unions. So there is some tension within the corporatist structures. On the other hand, 2 years ago, we were able to strike a deal between the trade unions and employers and the government on a competitiveness pact, which actually is a classical internal devaluation in a situation we had to do that because we had lost our cost competitiveness. Now we have regained that, and the Finnish economy is, while in 2015 we had zero growth, now we have a growth of 3% in the Finnish economy, which is also, by the way, felt positively in Estonia. On the true Finns and their socialization, I will leave the rest of that to Heather, but as regards the true Finns, I recall that in Finland, for instance, and I think it's important to note that all countries are different in this regard, so we cannot copy solutions from one country to another country very easily. In the Finnish case, we had the tradition of President Kekkonen integrating the communists to the society because they continuously scored over 20% in the elections. So in 1966, Kekkonen agreed to a coalition government of center and the left parties, which then over the years led to a situation where the Communist Party was split because it was a combination of populists and Stalinists. And it couldn't last when facing the responsibility of government. I'm not saying that this was the say platform or mainframe for for more recent events, but certainly it affected the mood of the Finnish decision makers in 2015 when we had the coalition talks between the three winners of the elections, which were the Centre Party, National Coalition Party and the True Finns Party. And for instance, I had come back to the democratic politics of Finland with a very pro-European agenda because I wanted to challenge the populists on the ground. We gained enough that we stopped the wave, but what happened was a certain paradox that I ended up in coalition talks with the populist in chief, Mr. Soini, my good old student friend, and we drafted the EU and Eurozone part of the government program, spending 9 hours together, and we have survived these 3 years since then. By the way, his master's thesis in the late 1980s at the University of Helsinki was on political populism as an ideology, and mine was on the possibilities of reform by social movements. So we've kept our trade in that.
What about Eurozone budget? Is that something to discuss more thoroughly?
I think it's an important subject, and I know that there is skepticism in Northern Europe in this regard, elsewhere as well, perhaps. But at the same time, I think if you look at the proposals of Germany and France by the governments to which you referred, as well as the 14 economists, German and French economists earlier this year, I think there is actually a quite positive foundation for moving forward. And here I would say that the priority is to complete the banking union, which implies creating the backstop for the single resolution fund so that our bail-in rules are credible, so that we can ensure financial stability and avoid the taxpayer paying the bill, and then gradually move towards a European deposit insurance scheme by balancing risk reduction in the banking sector by member states with these European initiatives. So that's the priority number one. Then the second issue is how do you reform the rules of fiscal policy, and here I note positively that Germany and France have recently proposed to use the expenditure rule. I'm not going into details, but that's the rule that is used, for instance, in Sweden, in Finland, in the Netherlands, with very good results as regards stability of public finances. It's a better rule than the current EU rule, in fact. And third, I think it's important to see how we can support investment and if we can create economic instruments that support economic reforms within the Eurozone. And here I have to say that how could I personally oppose something that I was proposing 5 years ago as Commission Vice President on Economic and Monetary Affairs, because we proposed then the creation of a, if I recall correctly, competitiveness and convergence instrument which very much resembles kind of a targeted investment device as part of the European Union budget together with the European Investment Bank. So less than only red lines, please, let's try to build bridges and have a constructive approach in reforming the Eurozone, because we need to have it reformed before the next recession or downturn hits Europe.
Heather.
I just wanted to address briefly the question about populists negotiating and Brussels as the Beltway. Yeah, of course populists negotiate. They're politicians. You have to, and it's all about power, ultimately. But in the way they present themselves and they present what is politics to the world, they never go out there and say, I'm a really good negotiator. You know, well, Trump says, I get a good deal because it's always going to be on my terms. But the idea of coming to a compromise where you give something to get something, the idea that you form a consensus around it, that's not part of the populist mindset about politics. It's all about, it's going to be on my terms, I'm the strong guy, and no pasaran. You know, it's very strongman view of the world. So it's not as if they go into politics saying, I'm going to find a compromise that suits everybody's interests. It's all about, I'm going to find a compromise that suits the interests of the will of the people as I represent it. And in terms of Brussels, you're right that the symbolic importance of Brussels has grown and grown because it's being used in political debate in Europe the same way that Washington is used in the US, without an acknowledgement that Brussels is simply the forum. It's a set of buildings where negotiations happen, where politics happens between many different member states, 28 just at the moment, and between many different levels of government. Brussels is not one united institution, one political elite. It's actually 28 different countries who come together in Brussels to negotiate in the council, or 28 different commissioners who come together, and of course parliamentarians and so on. And so I think this is a real problem, that the public gets the impression that there is this monolith of Brussels which simply decides things like a world government, when actually what you have is a very multivariate and extremely contested political space. It's a forum of debate in a political space where things are often held up for years. I mean, I was saying earlier that I think the reason why the euro crisis became so big, and the migration crisis as well, is the failure to agree to make decisions because the contestation was too big, the gaps between the interests were too big, and the lack of willingness to come to an agreement and to a consensus.
There's, if I may comment on that, there's one very good example, very bad example of this, in fact, in a sense that in spring 2010, we tried to propose a strong economic stabilizer when the European economy was about to collapse because of the huge financial market turbulence after Greece and Ireland in sight, and Portugal and Spain and Italy and other already been contaminated. So we proposed by the European Commission, we proposed the creation of a community instrument which could use the EU budget, and then beyond that joint and several guarantees which are sometimes called Eurobonds to stabilize the situation. That was a no-go in the Council, which then led to the creation of the European Financial Stability Facility. Okay, that saved the situation for some months. Quite soon the markets realized that while its headline strength was 440 billion euros, in effect, because of its internal mechanism of being sliced responsibilities to different member states, it only carried some 200 billion weight. And once the markets realized that, say 6 to 12 months after the creation of the EFSF, we had to go back to the meeting room and start working again, because the turbulence was again rising in 2011-12. If we had done it once and for all, like the Americans did in 2008-9, Europe would have been saved from much social and human misery.
Thank you very much, Olli and Heather. I believe you deserve a round of applause.